So this is your podcast for your muscles in your table. So this is just me simply talking them through. Sometimes this is a really good way to listen. If you just have it playing on in the background, you'll be surprised at how much will actually sink in. So we're going to start with the muscles of the neck, forelimb and scapula. If I was really intelligent, I'll probably do you a nice little rap to this. But unfortunately, you're just going to have to listen to my monotone voice. But hopefully this is going to help you obviously take in the information, and it's something that you can play at any point in the car or at home, and you can just recite along to. Sometimes if you just have it playing in the background, you'd be surprised, like I said, how much you'll actually take in. So the first muscle is the masseter muscle. So the origin is the zygomatic arch, and the insertion is the mesenteric fossa of the mandible. And what this does is it raises the mandible, and it's innervated by the masticatory nerve. The next muscle is trapezius. So this originates at the dorsal median raphe of the neck, from the third cervical vertebrae to the spinous processes of T1 to 9. Insertion, so the cervical part, so this is the part that's in front, inserts onto the dorsal 2/3 of the scapula, and then the thoracic part inserts onto the dorsal 1/3 of the scapula. Acting together, what they do is they draw the scapula up, but the cervical part can do cranial dorsal movement, and then the thoracic part can do caudodorsal movement. And the innervation is the dorsal branch of the accessory nerve. The next muscle is cleidocervicalis. So the origin is the dorsal median raphe of the neck, cranial to the trapezius, and inserts onto the clavicular intersection. The action is it draws the limb forwards, and it is innervated by the dorsal branch of the accessory nerve. Sternocephalicus, so it originates at the first sternobra, or the manubrium, and inserts onto the mastoid process of the temporal bone and the nuchal crest of the occipital bone. It draws the head ventrally and to one side, and is also a forelimb protractor, and the innervation is the accessory nerve. Brachiocephalicus, so this is obviously made up of the cleidocephalicus and the cleidobrachialis. So the cleidobrachialis is the part that's distal to the clavicular intersection, and then the cleidocervicalis part is the part that's proximal to the clavicular intersection. But for the purposes of your exam, brachiocephalicus is these two muscles together, okay? So the origin is the dorsal 1/3 of the humerus, cranial border, and it crosses the cranial lateral surface of the shoulder and divides into two parts at the clavicular intersection. So one part goes up onto the nuchal crest of the occipital bone, and then the other part goes onto the mastoid process. So this muscle advances the limb to extend the shoulder and can also draw the head to one side, and it's innervated by the accessory nerve and the ventral branches of the cervical nerves. Omotransversarius, so the origin is the acromion of the scapula and inserts onto the wing of the atlas. What it does is it draws the limb forwards and bends the neck to one side, and it is innervated by the ventral branch of the fourth cervical nerve. Deltoideus, so this is the spine and the acromion of the scapula, and guess where it inserts? The deltoid tuberosity. It is a flexor of the shoulder and is innervated by the axillary nerve. Brachialis originates at the lateral supracondylar crest and inserts onto the distal medial radius, and is a flexor of the elbow and is innervated by the radial nerve. Then you have the deep pectoral first, which originates from the body of the sternum and then inserts onto the greater and lesser tubercles of the humerus and the brachial fascia. It supports the trunk and is a retractor of the limb and fixes the shoulder joint, and is innervated by the caudal pectoral nerve. Superficial pectoral and sort of the transverse and the descending is the, so that's obviously what it's made up of, originates from the manubrium and the cranial part of the sternum and inserts onto the greater tubercle. It is a trunk limb attachment, so it's an abductor, a protractor and a retractor, and is innervated by the cranial pectoral nerve. Cutaneous trunci is just on there because I just want you to know, because you're going to need it for your neurological testing. But basically it's a thin sheet of muscle that covers the dorsal and lateral walls of the abdomen and thorax and sort of attaches to superficial fascia, and it's what makes the skin twitch. So when we're testing it, we're testing the lateral thoracic nerve all the way along. The next muscle is the rhomboid. So it's made up of capitis, a cervical part and a thoracic part. So the capital part is made up of originates at the nuchal crest. Then the cervical part originates at the dorsum medium raphe of the neck from the second cervical vertebrae to the first thoracic. And then the thoracic part is the cranial thoracic spines and inserts onto the medial surface of the scapular cartilage. What it does is it fixates the thoracic limb, elevates the scapula and draws it forwards, and it is innervated by the ventral branches of the cervical nerve. Then we've got teres major and minor. So teres major originates at the caudal margin of the scapula and inserts onto the teres major tuberosity and is a flexor of the shoulder joint and is innervated by the axillary nerve. Teres minor originates at the infraglenoidal tubercle and the distal infraspinous fossa and inserts onto the teres minor tuberosity and is also a flexor of the shoulder and additionally innervated by the axillary nerve. Supraspinatus originates at the supraspinous fossa and the spine of the scapula and inserts onto the greater tubercle of the humerus. It extends and fixes the shoulder joint and is innervated by the subscapular nerve. Infraspinatus originates at the infraspinous fossa and the spine of the scapula and inserts onto the infraspinatus muscle surface of the humerus. Its action is to be a flexor and abductor of the shoulder and is innervated by the suprascapular nerve. Subscapularis, so this originates at the suprascapular fossa and inserts onto the lesser tubercle of the humerus, and it is an abductor of the shoulder. Its innervation is the subscapular nerve mainly, and also can additionally be the axillary as well. Serratus ventralis, so again we've got a cervical and a thoracic portion. So the transverse process is the cervical vertebrae 2 to 7 is the cervical part, and then ribs 1 to 7 is the thoracic part, and it inserts onto the facies serrata of the scapula. It's the most important muscle that supports the trunk and raises the neck, and it is innervated by the ventral branches of the cervical nerve and additionally the long thoracic nerve. Sternocephalicus, which I believe I've already just said. Yes, we've already got it, so we'll go on to the next one. Sternocleidomastoideus. So this originates at the clavicular intersection and the manubrium of the sternum and inserts onto the mastoid process of the temporal bone and the nuchal crest, and it is a protractor of the forelimb and draws the head ventrally to one side and is innervated by the accessory nerve. Tensor fasciae antebrachii originates at the caudal margin of the scapula and the latissimus dorsi muscle and inserts onto the olecranon and the antebrachial fascia and is an elbow extensor and a tensor of the forearm fascia and is innervated by the radial nerve. Then the triceps, we've got long, lateral, medial and accessory. So we've got 4 heads. So the caudal margin of the scapula is the long head. The lateral head originates at the proximal lateral humerus. The medial head conveniently originates at the medial humerus. And then the accessory is the caudal neck of the humerus. They all insert down onto the olecranon and they are extensor of the elbow, all of them, but it's only the long head that flexes the shoulder and is innervated by the radial nerve. Biceps brachii goes from the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula and inserts onto the radial tuberosities and the proximal medial ulna and is an elbow flexor and is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. Latissimus dorsi originates at the thoracolumbar fascia and inserts onto the teres major tuberosity. It draws the limb caudally and is a flexor of the shoulder, and when the limb is fixed, draws the trunk forwards and is innervated by the thoracodorsal nerve. Then subscapularis originates at the subscapular fossa and its insertion is the lesser tubercle of the humerus and is an abductor of the shoulder joint and is innervated by the subscapular and the axillary nerve. So we're now going to go on to the muscles of the distal forelimb. Okay, so this is the muscles of the forelimb, distal limb. So the radiocarpal extensor goes from the lateral supracondylar crest down onto metacarpals 2 to 5, and it's an extensor of the carpus and is innervated by the radial nerve. Then extensor carpi ulnaris originates at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and inserts down onto metacarpals 5 and the accessory carpal bone, and extends the carpus as innervated by the radial nerve. Then we've got the common digital extensor, which comes from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and inserts down onto the distal phalanxes, digits of 2 to 5, and the action is the extensor of the digits and the carpus is innervated by the radial nerve. Then we've got the lateral digital extensor, which comes from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and inserts down onto the distal phalanxes of digits 3 to 5 and extends these digits and is innervated by the radial nerve. Then we've got the supinator, which originates at the lateral collateral ligament of the elbow joint and inserts onto the proximal cranial lateral surface of the humerus. And its action is supination of the forelimbs. This means it rotates the forearm and the distal limb laterally and is innervated by the radial nerve. Then we've got pronator teres. The origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus and it inserts onto the proximal cranial medial radius. Its action is to turn the cranial forearm and the distal limb medially this time, so it's a pronator, and is innervated by the median nerve. Then we've got flexor carpi ulnaris. The origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the olecranon and inserts onto the accessory carpal bone. The action is it's a flexor of the carpal joint and is innervated by the ulnar nerve. Then we've got the superficial digital flexor. The origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus and inserts onto the flexor tuberosities of the middle phalanx and digits 2 to 5. And the action is to flex the digits and the carpus and is innervated by the median nerve. Then we've got the flexor carpi radialis. So that comes from the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Inserts onto metacarpals 2 to 3 and is a flexor of the carpus and is innervated by the median nerve. Then we've got the deep digital flexor, which comes from the median epicondyle of the humerus and the radius and the ulna and inserts onto the flexor tuberosities of the middle phalanx and digits 1 to 5. And its action is a flexor of the digits and the carpus and is innervated by the median and the ulnar nerve. Then we've got pronator quadratus. This bridges the interosseous space between the radius and the ulna and is involved with pronation and is innervated by the median nerve. So now we're going on to the muscles of the pelvis and the hind limbs. So we've got sartorius, the cranial and the caudal part. So the origin is the tuber coxae and the iliac crest, and it inserts onto the crural fascia and the cranial margin of the tibia. The action is to flex the hip, extend the stifle, which is the cranial part, flexor of the stifle, which is the caudal part, and acting together, draw the limb forwards and abduct. The innervation is the femoral and the saphenous nerve. The next muscle is the gluteus. This is made up into 3 parts of the superficial, middle and deep. So we've got the superficial first, which comes from the gluteal fascia, the lateral part of the sacrum, the first caudal vertebrae, the sacrus tuberous ligament, and inserts onto the gluteal tuberosity. And the action is extensor of the hip and draws the limb caudally and is innervated by the caudal gluteal nerve. The middle gluteal originates at the gluteal fascia and the wing of the ilium and inserts onto the trochanter major. It is extensor of the hip, draws the limb caudally and outward, and it's innervated by the cranial gluteal nerve. Then we've got the deep gluteal, which originates at the gluteal surface of the ilium, inserts onto the cranial part of trochanter major. It supports abduction of the gluteal middle one and then rotates the femur medially. It's innervated by the cranial gluteal nerve. Tensor fasciae lata. So that is originates at the tubercocci. It inserts onto the patella and the tibial tuberosity by the fascia lata and the patellar ligament. It is a flexor of the hip joint, extensor of the stifle, tensor of the fascia lata, draws the limb forwards in movement and is innervated by the cranial gluteal nerve. Biceps femoris, that comes from the ischiac tuberosity and the sacrus tuberous ligament, inserts onto the patellar ligament, the tibial tuberosity, the cranial part of the tibia, the crural fascia and the tubercalcaneal. It is an extensor of the hip, stifle and hock when weight bearing, and in non-weight bearing flexes the stifle and is an abductor of the limb. The innervation is the sciatic nerve and the caudal gluteal nerve. The abductor muscle comes from the pelvic symphysis by the symphyseal tendon and inserts onto the facies aspera of the femur. It is an abductor of the hind limb and is innervated by the obturator nerve. Semitendinosus comes from the ischiatic tuberosity and inserts onto the medial surface of the tibia, the tubercalcaneal with the tendon of the gracilis muscle. It extends the hip, stifle and hock and is innervated by the sciatic nerve. Semimembranosus comes from the ischiatic tuberosity, the medial condyle of the femur, so that's the cranial portion, and the medial condyle of the tibia, which is the caudal portion, and it extends the hip, stifle and hock and is innervated by the sciatic nerve. Pectineus comes from iliopubic eminence, inserts onto the medial lip of the facies aspera. It is an abductor of the hind limb and it was also a flexor of the hip joint, and it is innervated by the obturator nerve. Gracilis originates by aponeurosis with the symphyseal tendon to the pelvic symphysis. It inserts onto the medial crural fascia and the tubercalcaneal. It's an abductor and extensor of the hock joint and is innervated by the obturator nerve. The internal obturator originates at the symphysis of the pelvis and the dorsal surface of the ischium and pubis. It inserts onto the trochanteric fossa and it rotates the limb laterally at the hip and is innervated by the sciatic nerve. We move on to quadratus femoris. So this originates at the ventral surface of the ischium and inserts onto the caudal surface of the femur, distal to the trochanteric fossa. Its action is it rotates the limb laterally at the hip joint and extends the hip, and the innervation is the sciatic nerve. The external obturator originates in the ventral surface of the pubis and the ischium, and it inserts onto the trochanteric fossa. It rotates the limb laterally and assists in extending the hip joint as innervated by the obturator nerve. Then we've got the quadriceps femoris. So this is made up of 4 heads. So we've got the rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius and vastus medialis. So rectus femoris originates from the cranial ventral iliac spine and inserts onto the tibial tuberosity by the patellar ligament and is the main extensor of the stifle. The rectus also, and it's the only one that does this, flexes the hip joint also and is innervated by the femoral nerve. Vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius and vastus medialis all come from the cranial lateral femur. They all insert into the patellar sesamoid bone in the tendon of the quadriceps, and they are the main extensors of the stifle and are all innervated by the femoral nerve. Popliteus, so that comes from the lateral condyle of the femur down to the proximal caudal surface of the tibia, and it is a flexor of the stifle joint and is innervated by the tibial nerve. Gastrocnemius originates from the distal femur and the medial lateral supracondylar tuberosities and inserts onto the tubercalcaneal. It is an extensor of the hock and a flexor of the stifle and is innervated by the tibia nerve. So the distal muscles of the hind limb, so you'll be pleased to know there's a lot less of these. We've got the cranial tibial muscle, which can be cranial tibialis, which originates from the proximal cranial surface of the tibia and inserts onto the proximal metatarsal 1. It is a flexor of the hock and a supranator and is innervated by the perineal nerve. Long digital extensor comes from the extensor fossa of the femur and inserts onto the dorsal aspect of distal phalanx of digits 2 to 5 and is an extensor of the digits, and again is innervated by the perineal nerve. Peroneus longus originates from the lateral condyle of the tibia and the head of the femur, and inserts onto the plantar tubercles at the proximal ends of the metatarsals 2 to 5, and turns the plantar surface of the paw laterally. So again, this helps with pronation, and is innervated by the perineal nerve. Then we've got superdigital flexor, so that comes from the lateral supracondylar tuberosities and inserts onto the proximal palmar aspect of middle phalanx of digits 2 to 5, and the action is to flex the digits of 2 to 5, and the innervation is the Then we have the so the last one of your distal limb is the lateral digital flexor, which comes from the plantar aspect of the proximal 2/3 of the tibia and the proximal half of the fibula, and inserts onto the plantar surface base of each distal phalanx, and the action is to flex the digits and extend the tarsus, and is innervated by the tibial nerve. The next muscles are the ones of the spine. So the first one that we've got is splenius, which comes from the spinous processes of T1 to T3 and inserts onto the nuchal crest. Its action is extension and lateral flexion of the head and neck, and the innervation is the dorsal branches of the cervical and thoracic nerve. Then we've got iliocostalis, which obviously is two portions. So we've got the lumbar part and the thoracic part. So the origin of the lumbar is from the ilium and then inserts onto the transverse processes the lumbar vertebrae and the caudal ribs. And then we've got the thoracic part, which comes from the several adjacent ribs and the transverse processes of C7, and inserts onto the caudal margin of ribs of origin and transverse process of C7. And then the lumbar part fixes the lumbar vertebrae and the ribs, and enables lateral flexion of the vertebral column. Then the thoracic part draws the ribs caudally in expiration and draws the ribs cranially in inspiration, and they are innervated by the dorsal branches of the cervical and thoracic nerve. Then we've got longissimus. So this is made up of a lumborum, thoracic, cervical and capitis part. So the lumbar and thoracic part comes from the spinous processes of the sacral, lumbar and thoracic vertebrae, and inserts onto the transverse and accessory processes of the lumbar and thoracic vertebrae and ribs. Then the cervical and the capital portion comes from the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae and the articular processes of the cervical vertebrae, and inserts onto the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae and the masetoid process of the temple bone. Action is a fixation and extension of the vertebral column and elevation of the head and neck, and lateral flexion of the trunk and neck when only one side is acting. It is innervated by the dorsal branches of the lumbar, thoracic and cervical nerves. Then we've got the spinalis. So again, that's got a thoracic and a cervical part. So the thoracic part comes from the lumbar, spinous and maxillary processes, and inserts onto the spinous processes of the cranial thoracic vertebrae. And the cervical portion comes from the cranial thoracic spinous processes and inserts onto the spinous processes of the cervical vertebrae up to the axis. What this does is fixation of the dorsum and the neck, but bends the trunk and the neck to the side of the muscle acting, and it's innervated by the dorsal branches of the lumbar, thoracic and cervical nerves. Then we've got semispinalis capitis, which originates from the transverse processes of the cranial thoracic vertebrae and the articular processes of the cervical vertebrae 3 to 7, and inserts onto the nuchal surface of the occipital bone and ventral to the nuchal crest, and it does elevation and lateral flexion of the head and neck, and is innervated by the dorsal branches of the cranial thoracic and spinal nerves. Then we've got multifidus, so it's made up of cervical, thoracic and lumbar portion. So the cervical part goes from the articular processes from the sacrum to the axis and inserts onto the spine of the axis. Then the thoracic and lumbar part comes from the mammillary and inserts onto the spinous processes of the vertebrae, 3 segments cranial to the vertebrae of origin. The idea is fixation and also rotation of the vertebral column, and is innervated by the dorsal branches of the segmental spinal nerves. Then we've got rectus capitis, so that's the dorsal margin of the spine of axis. Then it inserts onto the ventral branch of the nuchal crest, and the action is dorsal flexor of the atlanto-occipital joint, and is innervated by the dorsal branch of the first cervical nerve. Then we've got the sublumbar spinal muscles. So obviously these are the ones that you'll find more caudally. So we've got quadratus lumborum. So this is the last three thoracic vertebrae and the transverse lumbar processes, and inserts onto the transverse processes the cranial lumbar vertebrae. Action is fixation and lateral flexion of the lumbar and vertebral column, and is innervated by the ventral branches of the lumbar spinal nerve. Then we've got psoas major, so this originates from the vertebral ends of ribs 12 and 13, and the transverse processes of the cranial lumbar vertebrae, and inserts with the iliacus muscle forming the iliopsoas onto the trochanter minor. Action is flexor of the hip with the hind limb extended, draws the limb forward and is a suprameter of the hip joint, and stabilises the vertebral column. It's innervated by the ventral branches of the lumbar spinal nerves. Then we've got the iliacus. So this is the sacropelvic surface of the ilium, and inserts with the psoas muscle to form the iliopsoas, and inserts onto the trochanter minor. Its action is the same as the psoas major, and it is innervated by the ventral branches of the lumbar spinal nerves. Then we've got the psoas minor, so this is the last three thoracic vertebrae and the first four lumbar vertebrae and the tendon of the quadratus lumborum, and inserts onto the psoas minor tubercle of the ilium, and the action is the ventral flexion of the lumbar and the vertebral column, and the innervation is the ventral branches of the lumbar spinal nerve. Then we've got sacrocaudalis, so this is from the milio-articular processes of the caudal vertebrae. So this will be very far back in the sacrum, and inserts onto the spinous processes the sacral and the caudal vertebrae. So this is obviously starting to talk about the tail. And the action of this is to elevate and cause lateral flexion of the tail, and is innervated by the dorsal branches of the segmented spinal nerve. And then we've got the coccygeus, which it comes from the ischiac spine, and inserts onto the transverse processes of the first four caudal vertebrae. It draws the tail to one side, so it's involved with wagging, and then also when the muscle is contracting, it clamps the tail down, and it's innervated by the ventral branch of the third sacral vertebrae. So that's the end. That's all your muscles in your table. So you need to know all these muscles. And I hope you found this helpful. Bye bye.